This is Matthew Cratter from Trade University, and today I want to talk about the war on the US dollar. A lot of you have asked me to talk about the Ukraine-Russia crisis, and I want to cover it but in a more oblique way by giving you a little bit of a bigger picture about the geopolitical forces that are swirling around this particular incident. So we're going to start with inflation in the US, which has been really bad due to all the money printing. It's been really bad for the last 12 months, as we've seen even CPI prices being as high as they've ever been over the past 40 years. And this is obviously a political problem for incumbents, especially with the midterms coming up this fall. And Biden's approval ratings continue to plummet as CPI inflation continues to grow. And so what Biden has been trying to do, he's been trying to get OPEC and Russia to increase their oil output faster and to pump more barrels of oil, which is one way of keeping down, or would be one way of keeping down prices at the pump, which tend to have a large impact on how elections go in the US. So Biden did this back in November, and OPEC and Russia basically told him, no, they're not going to expand oil output any faster. He did it just a couple days ago, asking Saudi Arabia to pump more oil, and they also rebuffed him, as is covered in this article. As oil nears $100 a barrel, Saudis snub US and stick to Russian pact amid the Ukraine crisis. So I think this is a very significant signpost. If you're finding this video helpful so far, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. You might also enjoy this video about the collapsing petrodollar standard, which I will link to below. So what is OPEC plus? OPEC plus is just the oil producing countries of the Middle East plus Russia. And they've been working together, coordinating together really for the past, call it 4 or 5 years, and trying to coordinate marginal production of crude oil, marginal pumping of crude oil, and in this way trying to have an influence on the prices. This is the traditional list of OPEC countries. The really big ones, obviously, or the really big one really is Saudi Arabia, and then, of course, Russia. So people have taken to calling this OPEC plus, which is just OPEC plus Russia. It's very important to remember that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia made a deal in the 1970s to price oil and, by extension, global commodities in U.S. dollars. This is what took the place of the gold standard, which Nixon abandoned in 1971. So it wasn't that U.S. dollars were somehow backed by crude oil or exchangeable or redeemable for crude oil, but there is this backstop created to the U.S. dollar, trying to create demand for the U.S. dollar in the absence of a gold standard. And the way of doing this was to try to price global commodities, and in particular, crude oil in U.S. dollars. This is, you may have heard, the petrodollar standard. Petrodollars are just dollars that are involved in crude oil trade. And so the way the petrodollar standard worked is, if you were a country and you sold your oil for something other than U.S. dollars, as Iraq began to do in the early 2000s when they started selling their oil for euros instead of U.S. dollars, we know what happened to Saddam and Iraq. And I think that these sort of economic forces are often behind things, are very important. So this was the petrodollar standard. It was enforced by proof of war, which is U.S. military escapades all over the world. But we've seen that that has not ended very well. The kind of chaotic withdrawal out of Afghanistan in the middle of last year. And so the global superpowers, or would-be superpowers like China and Russia, are obviously paying attention to this and trying to use this to their advantage. This petrodollar standard is collapsing as more and more countries are choosing to buy or sell commodities like crude oil using currencies other than the US dollar. So China in particular wants to pay. They do a lot of manufacturing. They have a lot of energy needs. They need to import a lot of that energy. And they're tired of having to touch US dollars for this. They want to pay for their oil using renminbi, which is very nice because they can actually print up renminbi, whereas US dollars, they need to actually sell goods and services to get their hands on it. So China wants the same exorbitant privilege that the US has, being able to print up their own currency to buy crude oil. Russia wants to sell its oil and natural gas. It's obviously a huge energy exporter. And in the process, it wants to move away and has been moving away, as we're going to see, has been moving away from the US dollar and not having to deal with, not wanting to have to deal with sanctions, which have been happening since, call it 2012, 2013. So we've already seen this really since 2018 when China started paying using its local currency to buy crude oil. And it's only expanded since then. Meanwhile, Russia has been dumping U.S. government bonds, also known as Treasuries. They sharply reduced their Treasury holdings back in 2018. It was quite remarkable. They took them from $100 billion worth of U.S. Treasuries all the way down to below $20 billion. And I just looked this up this morning. These are, I believe, January numbers, so they're still fairly recent, January 2022. If we look at the total holdings by Russia of U.S. Treasuries, only just under $4 billion worth of Treasuries. This is expressed in millions, so this would be 3.91 billion. So currently, Russia owns fewer Treasuries or less Treasuries than Finland. Less Treasuries than Denmark. Finland owns about 7 billion. Denmark owns about 15 billion. Kazakhstan owns more, almost as many Treasuries as Russia does right now. So this is the move away from the US dollar. Obviously, Russia and the sanctions that have been applied to them by the US by the past couple administrations have encouraged this dumping of Treasuries, as well as the accumulation of gold. Russia has massively increased their gold holdings since the early 2000s, as we can see here. And they're trying to sort of create their own gold-backed currency in this way. So they're sort of backed by energy, by oil and natural gas production, and then gold reserves as well. So that leads to the question, why are the Saudis right now siding with Russia and refusing to pump more oil, as Biden has been requesting? Well, I think you don't need to look any further than the fact that Saudis are still, or have been really for the last year, the top supplier of crude oil to China. This is an article from September of 2021 talking about how Saudi Arabia has kept its ranking as China's top crude oil supplier for the 9th straight month in August. So Saudis doing business with China, as well as a lot of deals between Russia and China. This was one that I covered a few weeks ago. Russia and China agreeing to a 30-year natural gas pipeline. And the really interesting thing about this is it settles not in dollars, not in petrodollars, but settling in euros. This is another way that both countries are seeking to move away from the US dollar and deal directly, either using yuan or in this case, using euros. So what is happening here? We've basically seen a new global axis forming, and I think you have to see what's happening in the Ukraine and Russia really flexing its muscles here in this context of an alliance between Russia, China, and even the Saudis. All three in the process of moving away from the U.S. dollar. All three see a very weak United States that can be attacked economically. So what can they do? Russia and Saudi can keep oil prices high by being the marginal producers and making monthly adjustments to that. China can keep manufacturing prices quite high since the U.S. is still quite dependent on China for essential things, still dependent on China for medicines and essential manufacturing. I'm not sure if China's still making U.S. defense weapons for us or the parts for it, but they probably are. So Russia and Saudi Arabia can keep oil prices high. China can keep manufacturing prices high. They can blame it on supply chain disruptions caused by the last 2 years. And so you have this situation where inflation remains high in the U.S. and at the same time, there's less global demand for U.S. dollars. So if you don't need to stockpile U.S. dollars in order to buy crude oil, then a lot fewer countries need to hold on to U.S. dollars. And this is what we're seeing with Russia reducing their reserves of U.S. Treasuries. It basically means they're holding a lot fewer dollars, and they're replacing those dollars with gold. I don't think this is a reason to buy gold. I think Bitcoin is definitely the better option, but central banks are sort of old-fashioned. Russia's kind of an old-fashioned place as well, but they've got the right idea that you want to buy a very scarce asset. And there are a lot of rumors that Putin himself personally owns a lot of Bitcoin, and I wouldn't be surprised by that. So this makes sense. Fewer countries need to hold US dollars to buy crude oil. And why in the world would you want to hold treasuries that are yielding 2% when the inflation rate is, or the official inflation rate is 7 or 8%? Why in the world would you want to stockpile a currency that's being rapidly devalued by Fed money printing as the US dollar is? So less demand for petrodollars, in other words, dollars that need to be used in the trade of crude oil and natural gas, means less demand for US dollars and treasuries overall, which means that the Fed remains the buyer of last resort, for better or not. They're talking a very tough game right now, and that they're going to shrink their balance sheet and raise interest rates. A lot of this is already priced into the forward Fed funds rate and the Eurodollars rates. In terms of being actually able to shrink their balance sheet significantly, I'm extremely skeptical for these reasons. To the extent the world moves off of a petrodollar standard and moves to more of a multilateral currency standard, there's less demand for US dollars, and by extension, less demand for US Treasuries. But the government can't stop spending. The US government can't stop spending. We have entitlement spending, Medicare, Social Security, defense spending as well. The government will need to be funded, which means they're going to need to continue to issue treasuries. And if Russia and China are buying fewer of them, and the Saudis are buying fewer of them because they don't need the US dollars anymore, that means the Fed is really still the buyer of last resort, which is quite bullish for Bitcoin. It's quite bullish for asset prices in general, stocks, real estate, etc. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.